Okay, welcome back. This is Dr. Kalam again, and we're moving on to chapter 14 and learning outcome 14.1, which is simply defining employee relations. And this brief lecture is going to cover chapter 14 and chapter 15. So we'll begin a discussion about employee relations, and we'll end up on chapter 15 talking about collective bargaining and dealing with employees in a labor environment, labor union environment. So a simple question and a very brief discussion about employee relations, and we'll have this discussion in class. So so what is it? What is employee relations? What does that mean? So in some organizations, you'll have an HR department that has an employee relations department. They may have a labor relations department. They may have an employee services department, and they're named differently for specific reasons. In unionized or organizations which have collective bargaining agreements, you'll find that employee relations is probably, or labor relations are probably the two terms that are most commonly used, and for specific reasons we'll talk about in our lecture. So it's simply the managerial activity, what managers do, the way they interact with employees when there are issues that involves establishing and maintaining positive employee-employer relations. Now it seems quite obvious that in organizations where HR and the organization, and HR specifically, has policies that govern things like progressive discipline, corrective action, employee promotions, pay raises, embedded in the, and so on and so on, leave time and so on, embedded in their HR manual and in employee handbooks, that it might seem quite clear to employees when and employers and managers that items are very clear, and relationships develop from a deviation from either one of those as seen by either party. So it becomes this really strong negotiation point in non-labor environments. So, and we'll talk about labor environments later. So it's the building of positive employee relationships that contributes to satisfactory productivity. Productivity is that what we'll define productivity, and how both parties, management and labor, and I'll refer to them as parties moving forward in these two chapters, both parties agree upon the right way to continue to work. What are the motivational factors affecting employee performance and ultimately employee-employer relations in any environment? How do managers, HR people, and or the organization as a whole establish working relationships that foster these types of motivational incentives that keep employees focused at all levels? How about morale? When we talk about morale and employee-employer relations, how do we, one of the, I'll give you an example. One of the negative aspects that destroys morale is one of those things that actions by managers, for example, that seem to be favoritism or unfair or special treatment for some people. And that happens all the time, and it's actually unavoidable, but it's how we deal with them as managers, and how we deal with them in HR, how we mediate unfair treatment or inequity in any way, so that morale is maintained. And then obviously there's this thing called discipline that we must abide by, and it's guided by our policies, guided by our procedures, the handbook, legal issues or legal precedents establish our working, how we work towards discipline. So discipline, one of the things that we must make sure in our organization is that discipline is distributed in a fair and equitable manner. And we also need to maintain, very strong, positive relationships with our employees. Positive doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to like everything we do. So as we move along that continuum from morale to discipline to positive relationships, we must understand that there are times when some people who deviate are treated one way, and others who are deviated less or who do deviate less are treated accordingly. So there's an equitable treatment of people along that morale, discipline, and positive environment that helps to keep people productive and to build a cohesive work environment. And as we know, part of cohesion in the workplace involves communication and communicating things and changes, policies, new strategies, new ways of doing business with employees. So having a very open, transparent environment also leads to cohesive work relationships and a positive employee relationship environment. So as we move forward, let's go on to and discuss chapter 15, 5.2, which starts to talk about unions and the law. And learning outcome 5.2 simply talks about discussing the main features of at least 3 major pieces of legislation that we'll go over in this particular module. So let's talk about unions and the law briefly. So there were no special labor unions in this country, in the United States, until around 1930. And as you recall, the Great Depression was ending, I guess, around that time. And in response to changing public attitudes, values, and economic conditions, labor laws have gone through 3 clear epochs in time, or changes, from strong encouragement of unions to modified encouragement coupled with regulation, and finally to detailed regulation of internal union affairs. So it's moved from a highly supported environment to one where it's still supported, but it's highly regulated. So, and there were several reasons for that. So anyway, we'll talk about things like the period of strong encouragement. And there was a act, the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932, and the National Labor Relations, the NLR Act, also known as the Wagner Act, and each had gave the employees the right to collectively, free from harassment or interference or restraint or coercion in any way, to form unions. The National Labor Relations Act, for example, banned certain unfair union labor practices. They provided a secret ballot process for union organizing and so forth. So, and another period was about 14, 15 years later. It was a period of modified encouragement and coupled with some regulation. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was the one that really amended the Wagner Act with provisions aimed at limiting unions in several ways. One of them was by prohibiting unfair union labor practices, by enumerating the rights of employees as union members, and enumerating the rights of employers, as well as allowing the President of the United States to temporarily bar national emergency strikes. And this was interesting. I'm not sure if any of you students in this course are familiar with Ronald Reagan's move to make a strike by the air traffic controllers in the early 1980s illegal. And by making it illegal, he enacted or used this act to use it, to do that. As a result, he fired every striking air traffic controller in the United States and brought on new people, which is probably one of the few events of its type or its kind to happen. And the reason he was able to do that is because that particular body of people, the air traffic controllers, were essential employees who weren't permitted to strike, basically just because of the nature of their jobs. Anyway, so let's talk about finally the how labor law is today. So unions are pushing for new legislation. They want to substantially improve their efforts. On the other side of that, we have to consider globalization, changing economic times, increased competition, and a different type of competition. So as we embark upon movement in the globe to compete in different markets, labor unions in this country are facing somewhat of a challenge in terms of economic realities. Shrinking state budgets, for example, with government employees who are typically in a collective bargaining scenario, and they've undoubtedly reduced union membership through those shrinking budgets. So as we move through this particular chapter and week 6, we'll be discussing this interesting concept of unionization in the United States. So thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for